Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi there, morning everybody. Welcome to one of our Change Managers Network webinars. Today we've got Dr. Nick Wylie from Coventry University who's going to talk to us about his research around the TESI model, and it's about organising change managers. So hopefully it'll be of interest to everybody. I know I've had a bit of a chat there with Nick just before we came live and it sounds really interesting, so I think there'll definitely be a lot of interest from you all. As usual, what we'll do is I'll hand over to Nick. He'll give his presentation for about half an hour or so, and then we'll have some time for some questions and thoughts. As usual, what you can do, you'll have your question box on the right hand side there, so as we go through the presentation, if there's things that come to mind, please just put them in the box, and after the presentation I'll pick them up and read them out for Nick. And likewise, he'll have his email at the end as well if there's anything that anybody else wants to follow up offline. Also should say the presentation and questions, we will be recording this today and it will go up on the Knowledge Hub after the session as along with the slides and anything else that maybe Nick refers to that we can pick up on. So I hope you enjoy the session and I'll just hand you over to Nick just now. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Good morning, everybody. As I said, my name's Dr. Nick Wylie. I'm talking to you from Coventry University. I'm a principal lecturer here in human resource management, and I have a range of research interests broadly related to HR around change, around the professionalisation of the HR function, and also an interest in issues of change managers and how they operate. And that's going to be the research that I'm going to be referring to today and talking about in this webinar. I suspect that this is perhaps a slightly different session from some of the others that have been run as part of the network, because I don't claim to be a change manager. I don't have personal experience of operating as a change manager to talk about, but instead I want to talk about research into the role of change managers, and particularly focusing on this issue of how change managers are organised in different organisations. And the TESI model that I'll talk about in more detail looks at some of the options that organisations, including those in the public sector, have when they think about how they're going to arrange the practices of change managers and some of the challenges associated with doing that. So I hope that the research findings presented through the model are going to be of interest to everyone. They're going to perhaps resonate with your experience, as well as give you some points for reflection on your practice and that of the teams or the units that you are part of. Just to say briefly that as well, that this research was conducted in collaboration with Professor Andrew Sturdy, who's from Bristol University. Unfortunately, Andrew can't join us on the webinar, but this is a joint research project with Andrew. And I suppose my final kind of caveat, getting all my excuses in nice and early, is that the research is not specific to the public sector, although, as I will go on to explain, some of the organisations that where we did research and looking at the role of change managers were public sector organisations, and some, including some local authorities. And so I'm not going to be talking about the broader change agenda in the public sector and in Scotland as well. I'm focusing more on the experience of what it means to be a change manager working in a change management or programme management unit in different organisations to hopefully give you some idea of what are some of the common themes and common challenges associated with that particular role. So let me just give you a brief overview of what I'm going to cover in the next 25 minutes or so. Just some brief background to the research. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but as Claire mentioned, if you want to find out more about the research, then you can obviously get in touch with me and I'll happily discuss that with you at a later stage. I want to explain a little bit more about why our research emphasises issues of organisation and structure in relation to change managers. I'm then going to talk through the TESI model and the the different types of change management units that we've identified through that model, and then just some broad conclusions, some of the implications of our research and any next steps that you might be interested in taking to learn more about our research. So yeah, let me begin by just giving some background to the research. It's important to say this was research that was funded by the ESRC, which is the Economic and Social Research Council. So it was publicly funded research. The broad aim of the research, and really where we started, was looking to say, well, what are the alternatives organisations have to using external consultants? And I know that's a recurring theme in the public sector and in a range of different public sector organisations about how can they reduce spend on external consultancies, and so how can they develop their own internal change processes? How can they use change managers, project managers, different forms of internal consultancy to deliver change in a way that is as effective as external consultants, but often comes with a smaller price tag. So the research started by saying, how are organisations approaching internal change? How are they operating and organising their change managers, their change specialists? So this was quite exploratory research, because there isn't, certainly in an academic world, there isn't a great deal of research on these types of issues. And so we were exploring what were some of the key themes, and across the whole research project we conducted nearly 100 interviews with change managers, but also some I call them here clients or operational managers, and we did that across 24 public and private sector organisations, as I mentioned. So it was quite extensive research, so we built up a good understanding of how change managers operated in a range of different organisations. One thing we didn't do in the research was identify and focus on a particular type of change, and as a result, across the research, across the project, we looked at a variety of different types of change. So we had change managers who were OD specialists, change managers looking, and project managers looking at process improvement. Cost reduction was obviously an important theme of some of the changes which we were exploring, and also change managers working at a very strategic level within their organisations, trying to deliver broad scale strategic change, which is something that I'm going to come back to. We did focus in the research on this idea of change management units, or program management teams as they were sometimes called, because we wanted to see how change managers were working together, were collaborating. So our focus was also on those units because they would contain individual change managers for whom change focus was the central feature of their role. So we were less focused on managers who had some responsibility for change alongside their other duties. Our interest was in units which were explicitly focused on delivering change. So providing, as the definition says here on this slide, teams that are providing change advice, facilitating change, delivering their expertise to operational managers, typically working on a range of different projects, or framing the change in terms of particular defined projects which would be delivered in particular timescales. So we did focus in on the role of those units, and within each unit there were three things we were particularly interested in. That was activities, so what were change management units doing, their relationships, so how did those change management units work alongside other parts of the organisation with operational managers, client managers and such like. And then also identity, so what we were interested to understand how change management units saw themselves, how they regarded the impact that they were having on the organisation, and what that meant for the role that they were playing within their particular organisation. So we had a relatively broad definition of change management units and change managers, and we were looking at some of those organisational issues. So I wanted to go on to just give an explanation of why we think through the research that issues of organisation and why organising change managers is our particular focus, and what do we mean by that. Very broadly speaking, we'd argue that successful change in any organisation, whether it's public or private sector, is often a combination of three things. It's the skills of change managers, which will come in various different forms, the tools and techniques that change managers will use, their methodologies that they apply within any particular context, but also organisational factors, so the wider context and the structures through which change managers operate and how the change is understood across the organisation. And our argument is really that, certainly within research, but I think more broadly when we talk about the idea of change, the organisational factors are often neglected, or they're not talked about at the same level of detail as the competencies that change managers need to have, and the wide range of tools and techniques. And I think, as I said in the introduction to the webinar, there's often a great deal of advice around what tools and techniques change managers should use, how they can develop their own competencies, but perhaps less on how they need to negotiate through some of the organisational factors. So in saying that, I'm not for a moment downplaying the significance of tools and techniques for the importance of change management competencies, but just trying to say, well, actually we think that organisational factors are often critical, and that was something that emerged very strongly in our research. And so I think I wanted to say, well, what do I mean then by organisational factors? And some of the things that I'm talking about here are reporting relationships or sponsorship. So who's sponsoring the change? Who do change management units report to? Who are they accountable to within their organisation? What is the scope of the change that they are delivering? What is its likely impact within the organisation? I would also include within that the perceptions of operational managers. So how are change management units viewed across the organisation by others, and what effect does that have on their ability to deliver change? Funding. Who's paying for the change management unit? I think that's often an important issue, and it came out significantly within our research. I know that funding as a whole is an issue across all of the public sector, but we're thinking here about organisational budgets. How does that work? How does the organisation as a whole contribute to the work of change management units? And I think that, broadly speaking, comes into something that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and that's issues about navigating organisational politics, and that's a deliberately small p politics. I know for many of you working in the local authority that large P politics plays a very significant role and particularly at the moment in a very sort of fluid political environment. But our research was thinking about how do change managers navigate through the particular sectional interests within their own organisation, and how do they manage those successfully in order to achieve change. So organising change managers comes from our focus in the research. It comes from a lot of what the change managers that we interviewed were talking about as having a significant impact on their particular roles. So what we've done then is we've drawn together some of those issues, some of that focus on organising change managers into what we call the TESI model, and it may seem as though it's a very complex and distinctive title for the model, but actually it's simply drawn from the names that we've given to 4 different types of change management units, which we think cover the way change management units are organised within a range of different organisations. So the 4 types are transformers, enforcers, specialists and independent. So the TESI model is drawn from the titles of those 4 types of change management units. And so our model is saying that, broadly speaking, there are 4 different ways that change managers can be organised and in order to have a particular impact. How do we differentiate between those four different types? Well, as you can see on the model, the two different axes are differentiated based on what we call structural integration and impact scope. So by structural integration, what we are getting at there is that a key factor in organising change management units is the extent to which they are part of the organisational structure. So we differentiate structural integration on whether the units are embedded within an organisational structure. Do they sit very clearly within a traditional organisational chart? Are they very clearly integrated within existing organisational hierarchies? Or are the change management units more detached? Are they somehow separate to the traditional organisational structure? Do they sit outside of those standard organisational hierarchies? So structural integration is one way we use to differentiate these units, and the other is the impact scope, which is effectively whether the change management unit is delivering change which is pan-organisational, so it has an impact across the whole organisation, or whether the change that is being delivered by the unit is more at the level of the business unit or the individual department, and that will mean slightly different things in different organisations. But effectively we're talking about whether the scope of change that the unit delivers is broad at organisational level or more specific at the level of individual functions or business units. So that's the broad way, and I'll come back to some of those points when I talk about each of the different models. What we're not saying in this research is we're not trying to be prescriptive and saying this is how change management units have to be organised, or that change management units take on one of these particular forms and then stick with that. Actually, what our research identified was there was often quite a dynamic nature of change management units, and they would shift in character. They would shift from one type to another, and sometimes they would be disbanded altogether. That this was quite a dynamic activity within organisations. So it's important to state that we recognise within this model there is always going to be a degree of shifting, rather than saying these are the it's a case of a change management unit choosing one of these options and sticking with it regardless of the broader context within the organisation. What I'm going to do is talk through each of those four different types. I'm going to do that fairly briefly, setting out some of the key features, what are some of the challenges of operating as this type of change management unit, and give a brief example from our research of a type of unit that comes under these titles. So I want to begin by talking about the transformers. So transformer units are those typically, from our research, larger units employing quite large numbers of change managers and project managers. A transformer unit is responsible for delivering pan-organisational change, which typically had a very significant strategic impact. It could be high-level cultural change or a real fundamental change to the way the organisation would operate. Transformer units tended to be created specifically to deliver that particular change. So that broad-scale change project or change program, they were created to deliver that. And as a result, transformer units tended to be more detached from organisational structures and from the traditional hierarchies. They tended to be slightly separate because they were created for that particular purpose. We also found a feature of transformer units where they would contain a mixture of internal specialists, so people who were brought in from different operational areas, and interestingly they would also look to individuals who had external consultancy experience. And so transformer units would combine people that had different backgrounds both within the organisation and out with the organisation. What were some of the challenges of being a transformer unit? Because obviously this was significant change, but with the high profile that came with the change that transformer units were delivering came high expectations that the change would have an impact, and that created an interesting dynamic. We also found in our research that transformer units could face quite strong sectional interest from operational managers, and that there would be some dispute over who was taking responsibility for impact. Because the change was so broad, it would impact on all operational areas, and therefore operational managers understandably wanted to feel that they were in control of the changes happening in their particular area. And transformers often had to kind of find a way to negotiate that. In some cases, the units took a more directive approach and a non-participative approach to change. They had to work within limited timescales to achieve their impact, so they had to occasionally work to say, this is what we're doing, and as operational managers you have to go along with it. It's not always up for discussion and for negotiation, which inevitably created some challenges. An example here of a transformer unit from the communications sector just represented that. This was a very large unit delivering large-scale cultural change within the organisation, over 100 people working on the change programme in different change management roles. And as the first quote here from a change manager says, that they recognised that actually sometimes the change had to really be forced through, because if it had been open to choice and negotiation, it might not have happened, and that demonstrates that often transformer units had to take a more directive approach. And the second quote there from an operational manager shows some of the challenges that the transformer unit faced, because this was an operational manager saying, look, we're in control, we know what we want to do, we know how we want to do it, and all we want from a central unit, a change management unit, is the people. We want the resources. So in this organisation there was a lot of tension around seeing the transformer unit simply as a body shop, providing people to deliver change, rather than having the unit themselves responsible for change. So transformer units faced a number of challenges, but were often involved in very significant change. If I could go on now to describe the enforcer units, which in many ways are similar to transformer units, but there were some important differences. So again, enforcers were change management units who were particularly responsible for translating strategic visions into very specific projects in different areas, but they weren't associated, so different to transformers, they weren't associated with one single strategic change program. They would work on various different projects, but those projects would all be related to aspects of an organisation's strategic vision. And as a result, the enforcer units tended to have a more ongoing role. They weren't necessarily working within a very particular time frame, and so they were more embedded within the organisational structure and the organisational hierarchy. For example, many enforcers worked as part of a CEO support unit, so they worked directly within the CEO's team, delivering their change. And that's really where the term enforcer comes, because many of these types of units had what we called a quasi-policing role. They were there to enforce the strategic priorities of senior managers, to ensure that the things senior managers wanted to happen were being delivered across a range of different areas, even if that meant enforcing people, requiring them to deliver change. Inevitably, there were challenges with this type of approach as well. They again could have a bit of an antagonistic relationships with operational managers. Sometimes they would be regarded with a bit of suspicion because of how closely associated these units were with particular individuals, so with CEOs, with deputy CEOs in some instances. So that could create a bit of suspicion. One change manager, part of an enforcer unit, talked about being the eyes and ears of the deputy CEO could close as many doors as it opened within the organisation. It also meant that enforcer units were very much dependent upon the whims, the interests of particular senior managers, which could be somewhat unstable, as this example demonstrates from the transport sector. An enforcer unit who reported directly to the CEO, and actually the CEO often used the existence of this enforcer change unit to threaten, in some senses, other senior managers, other operational managers, to say, if you don't go ahead and do this, then I'll get my clever guys down the corridor to come in and work with you. And so he was referring to the change management team and the enforcer unit in that particular way. And interestingly, the change manager in this unit said to us as part of the research, well, should this CEO move on and go somewhere else, then actually we would be a bit stranded, because they were so dependent upon upon that individual for getting particular types of change projects. And actually, when we went back to do some follow-up interviews, the change unit had been disbanded because that had actually happened. The CEO had moved on, and this enforcer unit was no longer seen to be necessary or required within the organisation. So the third type of change management unit that the TESI model identifies is that of specialists. So as the name would suggest, this was change management units formed of subject matter experts who would be delivering change around their particular specialism, and will be doing so in order to try to develop the status and credibility of their service functions. And as a result, they would be embedded very much in organisational structures. They would often be based in functions like IT or HR, so they would be very much part of the embedded within the organisation, within the organisational hierarchies. And also specialist units tended to have a more limited impact scope. They would work more at the level of the business unit or the department, rather than on explicitly organisational wide change. That didn't mean that those changes were any less important. It just meant that their focus was sometimes slightly narrower. Specialist change management functions also face some challenges. They could struggle to overcome people's assumptions about the service functions, and as I'll go and talk about, that was often an issue for change management units associated with HR departments. And also their narrower focus, because the change managers had particular specialisms, meant that sometimes they could offer fairly limited problem-solving solutions and change issues if the requirements of operational managers didn't directly map onto their interests. So they would often have, specialist change management units would often have to seek to collaborate with other change managers in other specialisms in order to be able to have an impact. An example here from an organisation in the media, where there was a team of OD specialists who were very much incorporated within the HR function. They reported into the HR director, and interestingly here the change manager talked about the link to HR being the thing that they have to get over in order to be able to deliver change. And so this change manager said to us that my link to HR is the thing that I have to get over more than anything else, so I kind of don't tell people. So almost disguising the link to HR in order to be able to deliver their specialist approach to change. The final type of change management unit we identified through the model and drawing on our research was what we called independent. So these are more generalist change management units, which were really responsible for finding their own change projects and also funding very often their own work through different mechanisms, still working obviously mainly within their organisation. And this was a model or a type of change management unit that most closely resembled that of an external consultancy. So as a result, these types of units were very detached from core structures. They were operated largely outside of managerial hierarchies. They might not, in some cases, they had no direct reporting relationships into senior managers. They tended to have a more localized impact scope, so they were delivering change within particular business units, but had a slightly more fluid role. Their independence, if you like, gave them the opportunity to do various different things. As change managers, they would sometimes build relationships with external consultancies, and even in some cases offer services to external clients. And there was some examples in our research of independent change management units building their credibility within their organisation through their work with external clients. Challenges here, as with all types of consultancies, how do you guarantee that there's a pipeline of work? They had to work very hard at relationship management activity to ensure that operational managers were thinking of them when they were faced with particular change projects, and they sometimes had quite complex funding arrangements. How were they going to get to work with operational managers to fund their work? And in this case, they were highly dependent upon their clients, their operational managers having the resources, and then more limited, obviously, within an internal market to deliver those services. So they could often, independent change management units could get involved in some very interesting work, but they had to work very hard often to generate that. A good example of an independent unit that worked effectively in a financial services organisation, and one that had really shifted. It had begun as a very much a process efficiency group. They called themselves stopwatch and clipboard people, to taking on a much wider role in a range of different change projects and project management work. And actually, they'd had such success, they'd begun to work with external clients. They'd been offered to do particular pieces of consultancy outside of the organisation because they built their reputation. But one of the challenges they faced was actually competition. There were a number of other independent change management units across this very large organisation, and who were even in the internal market were competing with this particular unit, and so that was often a challenge for them. So those are the 4 types of organisational change management units that we identified through our research, and how they engage with those organisational factors that I was talking about. One of the things I wanted to finish up with was saying, well, what's our suggestion for how we might, or how in your particular context you might be able to use the model? I think what we would see is this is a tool that can help aid reflection and analysis on the strengths and weaknesses of any change management unit that you are involved in, and so thinking about how you're operating, what are perhaps some of the barriers, what are the key enablers to delivering change within your context. We think that the model is a useful guide to say, where might we be located within that model? Do you identify more with one of those 4 types? And if so, does that say something about how you might develop, how you might address some of those challenges? As you've seen, as I've spoken about in relation to each of the 4 types of change management units, it's a challenging role, and I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that, but it's quite clear that delivering change through these types of units, the role of the change manager, can be some of the most interesting work in organisations, but it isn't straightforward. There is a lot of negotiation and engaging with a range of different operational managers, and so we hope the model helps to think about how issues of structural location, impact scope and other factors will enable or the change management units to become more effective. So I think one of the ways of doing that is that asking a series of different questions that can help you to think about where you might be located within the model, and also to reflect on the strengths of what you're doing as change managers in your organisation. So I've just some questions here. What does your structural location indicate about the unit? To whom do you report? What effect does that have on the change management unit, how it's seen across the organisation? What type of impact are you as change managers seeking to have? Is this about fundamental organisational change at a very broad level, or is this more incremental change supporting individual operational managers within particular business units or departments? How far do operational managers have a choice about working with us? That's a question that we saw in the role of transformers and enforcers. Sometimes change has to happen, but that's a question about how the nature of the change, how the relationships work with operational managers and with the change management units. And relatedly, an important question I think to ask is, well, how well do operational managers understand what we do, and does that matter? Do they need to understand? But if you think they do, well, how well is the change management unit understood? How well is it, if you like, promoted across the organisation? How well are relationships developed? So I think what we would hope is that you would be able to use this model, ask through these questions to reflect on where your change management unit, or where you as individual change managers even, are intending to go in the future. So just to conclude, I think that what we're saying through this model is that issues of organisational and structure related to the role of change managers can't be neglected. It has to be, you have to take account of those things alongside the particular skills and competencies of individual change managers and methodologies, tools and techniques that you're using to deliver change. And we hope so that understanding your position in relation to the TESI model can provide some additional insight to the types of challenges and opportunities that you will face as change managers in a very complex and demanding environment such as the public sector and in local authorities. So I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to share our research. There is obviously more to say in more detail about the model and about the research more generally. My email address is there. I really would like the opportunity to speak to you, to engage further around the research. So please do get in touch to share any thoughts or experiences, or if you want me to share more details, more information about the research. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope to be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks very much, Nick. That was really interesting, I think, or for me anyway, so I'm sure everybody else found it interesting as well. It was really interesting as well, particularly for me, thinking about the organisational factors. I'm sure like people would relate into that as well, particularly around the kind of funding, the perceptions of organisational managers and things as well. So if there is any questions, remember everybody, there's a wee box on the right hand side just to write anything down, and I can ask Nick. I don't know if Rhonda, maybe, yeah, I've got yours there. So what specific approach are more successful for particular sectors and work streams? Nick, that's one of the questions through.
That's a really great question. I think what we weren't able to identify through the research were particular sector based factors. What our research, because it was exploratory, it cut across a range of different sectors. So we had organisations from financial services, local authorities, as I mentioned, other public sector organisations, and I think we were almost surprised to say how similar the experiences were across these different across organisations working in different sectors. So that, I hope that doesn't sound like a cop-out. We were interested to see if there were clear distinctions between different sectors, whether those types of units would work more effectively in different types of organisations, but the evidence wasn't there within our research. I think there were the distinctions between those four different types, and success would often come down to how well change managers were able to negotiate their position, to establish their role within organisations, and again, that could depend on very particular organisational circumstances rather than features associated with particular sectors. So I appreciate that's a bit of a, I hope that's not too much of a non-answer to your question, but we weren't able to identify whether particular sectors had required a slightly different approach.
That's great, thanks Nick. We've also had another question through from David, our old colleague, who's over in Falkirk now. So he was just wondering about, in the sample of the change managers interviewed, what were the kind of numbers for each of the kind of segments in terms of like transformers, etc.?
We had a fairly even spread, but we were trying to obviously capture all of our different organisations. I think that we would say the most represented type of unit in our in our particular research were independents, and that were working separately, but we also found within that particular group they were often the most dynamic. They were the ones that sometimes struggled to sustain their role over a long period of time, and I think that after that we identified more enforcers, so groups who were reporting directly to CEOs were effectively enforcer units delivering change closely associated for chief executives or deputy chief executives, so very senior managers as well. So I think that there was a relatively even spread, but I think probably slightly more independents and enforcers than others.
That's great, thank you. I think unless anybody's got anything else, I think that might be the end of the questions. Is there anything else, Nick, that you'd want to kind of sum up with, or are you just quite happy if anybody's got any kind of further questions just to email you?
Yeah, I mean, as is important now in for all academics doing research, that we don't just talk to each other as academics, which we're very good at doing, and we're very keen to learn about how our research might be used in a range of different organisations. So if any of the people attending are interested to hear more, would like me to come and talk to their teams to develop the research further and the use of the model, then please do get in touch, because we're very keen to to engage outside of higher education with people working in different roles. But on that, no, thank you all very much for your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you.
That's great, Nick. Thanks very much. That was really interesting for us all. And just to kind of finish up today, just to say that obviously the recording and the slides from the presentation will be on the Knowledge Hub kind of later on today. And just to say that, just get up my screen there, you should see that all now. We've got our Change Managers Network. If anyone's not already a member, just to kind of sign up for that, and that's where you'll get all the resources. And just again, thanks very much for your contribution, Nick, and for the questions that we've got as well. Thank you.